So hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Atlantic Council this morning. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the release of our Atlantic Council strategy paper on Iran entitled A New Strategy for U.S.-Iran Relations in Transition, authored by our own distinguished fellow, Ellen Leibson. My name is Daniel Chu. I'm Deputy Director of the Scowcroft Center, and I'm Director of the Strategy Initiative here at the Atlantic Council, where we host the Atlantic Council strategy paper series. Let me tell you a little bit about the series and how this paper fits into it. We started the series a couple of years ago really as an effort to put issues from a more strategic perspective back on the table in a much more constructive and productive way to encourage dialogue. We don't claim to have the answers. We do claim to have important issues that we think require more and better discussion than, frankly, you tend to hear in a political year like we have today. So we put out this strategy paper series that covers a range of functional and regional issues. And then we put out this Iran paper in particular. And even though it doesn't fall in the usual bin of functional or broad regional, we felt in this year in particular it was really critical to do so. Between the recent developments with regard to the nuclear agreement with Iran and the current presidential election here in the United States and upcoming elections in Iran, we thought this was not only extremely important to raise at this time, but a pretty critical issue to raise again, hopefully in a more strategic and constructive manner. So that's what we're doing here with the Atlantic Council strategy paper, and that's why we're so pleased to present Ellen's paper on Iran strategy. I think as many of you in the room here know that the Council has been doing a lot of work on the Middle East and Iran. During the last election, we put out a series of memos for the President with a prominent article dealing with Iran. The Council has an Iran task force that looks into multiple facets of the relationship, and our Hariri Center here, of course, looks at political transitions in the Middle East region. Now, in particular, as we're looking to welcome a new administration in the new year, it is, of course, as I said before, a very important time to think about our relationship in particular with Iran. And Ellen's paper, I think, is a really great place to start. As you'll see, hopefully you've all had a chance to grab a hard copy of this. You'll see a great forward in there from General Scowcroft, where he says that this work by Ellen presents a strategic approach for how the United States can best engage Iran in the service of our vital interests in the turbulent but critically important Middle East. I'll add to this that what I really like about what Ellen's done here is she's really presented a balanced approach to looking at this issue, really tried to scope out the context for us, again, to have a really constructive dialogue on this, without doing what I see in so many other discussions on this topic, which is really to gravitate towards the kind of ends of the debate of either hoping for the best or assuming the worst. Former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel also said that the strategy in this paper can help seize this historic opportunity for change, and I couldn't agree more. So with that, let me get to the discussion I keep saying I hope we'll have on this. First, my thanks to the Middle East Peace and Security Initiative in our Brent Scowcroft Center, especially Owen Daniels for his very hard work in getting this paper here. I think Ellen and I both very much appreciate all the work that Owen has done on this. And of course, great thanks to Ellen for not only pulling this all together for us, but really making this a compelling read as we head into the election and a new administration. As you know, it wouldn't be a think tank event if we didn't have a panel, so I'm going to introduce very briefly the panel to you. Ellen, of course, I've mentioned a few times, is our distinguished fellow in the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center. She was president and CEO of the Stimson Center from 2002 to October 2015, and she was also in government for 25 years, most prominently as the vice chair of the National Intelligence Council from 1997 to 2002. We're also joined by Amir Hanjani. He is a council board director and president of PG International Commodity Trading Services, where he works on facilitating humanitarian trade into the Iranian market, among other things, and he's also a Truman National Security Fellow. Also joining us is Michael Connell, who's the Director of Iranian Studies, the Iranian Studies program at the Center for Naval Analyses, my old stomping grounds, actually. He has authored several studies that focus on political, military, and security issues related to Iran and the other Persian Gulf countries. His most recent work focuses on Iranian military culture, mill-to-mill engagement strategies, and Iran-GCC relations. He was also an intelligence officer in the U.S. Army. And finally, our moderator today, most of you will know, is David Sanger, the national security correspondent for the New York Times and one of the paper's senior writers. He's author of 2 bestsellers on foreign policy and national security, The Inheritance, The World Obama Confronts, and the Challenges to American Power, and Confront and Conceal, Obama's Secret Wars and Surprising Uses of American Power. I'm going to hand the floor over to the panel, and David will lead us. As I've said, we very much view this as a discussion. We appreciate you all joining us here today, and hope you'll join in with us on this very important topic. Please, David.
Well, thank you, Dan, for that introduction. Thank all of you for coming out here today. Thanks to the Atlantic Council. It's a great honor to be at the Scowcroft Center here. Brent has been a mentor to me and to many in this room as I look around, and so I can think of nothing that would make him happier than this kind of discussion that we're having today. And thanks to you, Ellen, for getting this conversation going. I read through the report, and here was my immediate reaction. It's a terrible report for the next 21 days, okay? Where I'm afraid the conversation about what to do with Iran is going to be limited, probably including tonight, to a series of bumper stickers about whether the deal was good or bad. It's a superb report for everything after November 9th, okay? So a good thing to get it out there and circulating for the next couple of weeks, because whoever wins the presidency is going to have to go deal with a much more complex, and I think in many ways much more nuanced Iran policy than we've had. Ellen and I have talked about Iran a lot over the past couple of years as I've been covering the deal and as we've traveled together to various conferences and so forth. And I guess my assessment at 15 months out is that within the 4 corners of the deal, it's working. The Iranians have done just about everything that they said they were going to go do. There are occasional arguments you hear here and there about small elements, but they're almost all completely at the margins. Outside the deal, anything that did not fall within those 130-odd pages of the agreement, I would say the situation is about the same, and in some cases worse than it was when the deal was signed. Iran's activities with Hezbollah in support of Assad, its challenges to the Saudis, its support of destabilization, the problems in Yemen, and even its rhetoric about the United States, the sentencing yesterday of 2 Iranian Americans, all suggest that the political churn that has gone on within Iran since the deal was signed is no closer to its resolution, and is not where the Obama administration hoped to be at the end of its term. It had hoped that the agreement would be the stepping stone to some broader set of relationships, whether it's common interests in dealing with ISIS, or common interests in the Gulf, or the building of greater economic or student ties or whatever, and that hasn't happened. So my hope over the next hour and a quarter or so that we have this discussion is that we'll be able to explore a little bit about what kind of strategy, as Ellen has tried to lay out here, might begin to get us to where the post-deal era was supposed to be, and what the challenges are going to be in that, in both the economic and the military and the political realms. And so we're going to talk up here for a while, and starting at around 10, I will turn to questions from all of you, so begin to think about what it is you want to go say. So Ellen, let me start with you about the report. If you agree, and I don't know necessarily you do, with the assessment I just offered, tell me what you think has been missing in the American and the West's effort to follow up on the JPOA, and why that's been missing, and what are the sort of biggest highlights if you were given 5 minutes with the next president, where you say that you've really got to concentrate on in year one to make this plan work?
Thanks, David. Well, first, I guess I may disagree a little bit with the assumption that the plan, we were supposed to go instantly and immediately from the success of the nuclear negotiations to a transformed relationship. I actually think the negotiators pretty well understood that that wasn't.
It's going to take a while.
It's going to take longer, okay,
Yeah.
if at all.
I agree.
And that the nuclear agreement was an achievement in and of itself. If we think back to early in the Obama administration, of all the things that he might have stated as goals vis-a-vis Iran, the one that he really stuck with was preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear power. So the agreement has an integrity in and of itself. I think Secretary Kerry, of course, was more forward-leaning than some in saying, let's test the proposition. Let's see if we can cooperate more on Syria. Let's see if it improves our ability to solve problems together. And there's some small data points to suggest that just these personal relationships that have been established do matter. It does allow us, there's more capacity to solve problems early when there's small tactical problems. But it's indisputably true that on both sides, both in the United States and Iran, there was a course correction after the nuclear agreement to make sure that the pendulum didn't swing too wildly in one direction. In both countries, in both Iran and the United States, there were clearly constituencies that were very skeptical about the merits of the deal and did not want to see us moving fast to a full normalization of relations. Certainly in Iran, I mean, I think it's a little poignant to me to be meeting on the day after the Namazis were sentenced. Let's hope that there's still a possibility of an acceptable outcome, but that there is obviously an undertow in Iran that if we think of the supreme leader as doling out, segments of power, and after having empowered the foreign ministry and President Rouhani to get to the finish line on the deal, there's some requirement, almost a law of physics, that he gives some greater authority to these other constituencies. It's a full year now, and we've seen these other constituencies re-empowered, if you will. But so there's always this mystery about what are Iran's long-term intentions. But in fairness to the Obama administration, I think they took a very realistic approach after the agreement was signed, saying it's probably not going to happen on our watch that there is a transformation of this relationship. The Iranians aren't ready, and maybe we're not ready. So I think there has been still some skepticism in the US about how far you want to go, in part because there are certainly aspects of Iran's conduct in the region that are inimical to US interests. I also think that, on the Iranian side, they still see the United States in largely adversarial terms. My logic in this paper is that Iran is not a pure adversary of the United States. We should be able to manage the challenge of Iran in a slightly more agile and productive way than we have in past decades. There will always be adversarial dimensions to it. We've got to make sure that we've covered our security requirements and the security interests of our friends and partners in the region. But I'd like to see us take a little more risk in deepening the channels for engagement. I do think that in international politics, having those personal connections and direct contact is pretty essential to how one manages international relations. So I'd like to think of the nuclear agreement as a new factual reality that would allow the next president to think of a decade-long process to begin moving towards normalization. Can normalization of relations be achieved in a decade? We don't know that. We don't know. It'll depend in part on the domestic politics of Iran, as well as what our own political, foreign policy, national security interests determine. But I think it should be a long-term objective of the United States to try to get to a more normal relationship with Iran.
Well, thanks. Amir, let me turn to you, because you actually do business with people in Iran. So you've been sort of right at the forefront.
Legal business.
Legal business. Right. We'll make that point, and we'll try by the end of the by 10:30 to make sure that you are still a free man. Okay. But you can give us a perspective that I think others can't about what the Iranians complain about the most, which is that they haven't seen the benefits of the deal. Now, in some ways, when you look at it statistically, from the gross statistics, it looks like they have their oil sales are up significantly, their oil production is up somewhat, the economy's growing a bit over 4%.
4.5%.
We take 4. We take 4.5%.
Better than here.
Yeah, we take that gladly. So in that sense, they have seen some significant improvement, but ordinary Iranians tell you they haven't seen a thing. Right. So give us first just a sense of how they perceive the benefits, if any, of having entered into the deal.
Well, I think the highlight figures are that they have really come back in the energy markets in a way that I think their Gulf Arab neighbors and even the Russians were quite surprised. They went from about 2.6 million barrels a day. They ramped it up. Now they're about 3.6, and they're going to 4. And if you see now the Russians and even the Saudis who are trying to cut a deal with OPEC to cut down limits, Iran says, no, we want to get our market share back to what it was before the sanctions came about. And they've been quite successful with that. The highlight figure is they're experiencing 4.2% growth this year, and that's after really 10 years of mismanagement under 8 years of mismanagement under Ahmadinejad. So that's the good news. The bad news for the average Iranian is they haven't really seen any of the benefits of it. Inflation is still high, unemployment is still high. The banking channels, this deal was done, in my view, for one of the reasons Iran wanted to do this deal was it wanted to get Europe back into business. That was Iran's traditional. The EU was Iran's largest trading partner before sanctions were implemented. That hasn't happened because the Europeans have been very skittish. The European banks have been very skittish. FDI, foreign direct investment from Europe, hasn't come in. And so Iran has turned completely eastward. And that's a new dynamic. That's a new dynamic that will affect Iran's foreign policy, has affected Iran's foreign policy, its economic growth. And they blame, I think, the Europeans as well. You have this funny dynamic where Secretary Kerry is going around the world telling everyone, Iran's open for business. Go ahead and do business. And they turn around to him and say, well, why aren't you doing business there? The United States is not doing business in Iran, but you want everyone else to do business. What happens if the new administration comes and they take a different view and they re-implement sanctions? And then the European banks who've paid, in the hundreds of billions of dollars in fines for working with Iran. So this dynamic hasn't really been worked out.
Let me ask you a little bit about the primary sanctions in the U.S. I mean, Secretary Kerry made it pretty clear during the time he was doing the negotiations and thereafter that if it was his druthers, we would begin over time, not all at once, to relieve some of the primary sanctions as a way of building just the relationship we were discussing. And when you read through Ellen's strategy, there's sort of no way for us to get there without, over time, unwinding some of those primary sanctions that the U.S. had. On the other hand, the Republicans who voted against, and all Republicans did vote against the JPOA, the only outlier I could see to that is the presidential candidate, Donald Trump. When I went to go interview him for one of our foreign policy interviews, he said, he was upset about the deal because American companies weren't selling, and Airbus and others were stepping in to our place. And I said, well, sir, the primary sanctions enacted and kept in by your party are preventing that. And he looked and he said, how stupid is that? Okay, so what are the chances, you think, no matter what happens in 3 weeks, that you're going to begin to see a change in the political atmosphere here that would enable those primary sanctions to begin to back away?
Well, I think from the Iranian perspective, they view President Obama in this negotiation as an aberration. They don't think that, whether it's Secretary Clinton or Donald Trump, that they don't really see, a gold pot at the end of the rainbow, because the things that the United States wants Iran to do to lift those primary sanctions, they believe are against Iranian interests and against Iran's security interests in the region. So I think that I'm really not hopeful. And a lot of this dynamic also, as Ellen said, is personalities. I mean, Zarif and Kerry, I think, talk to each other more than they talk to their wives. You get another Secretary of State in who doesn't have that dynamic with Zarif.
And we don't know how long Zarif will be.
We don't know how Iran's going into an election year. In 6 months they're going to have their presidential election. 7 months. So it's going to require a wholesale reevaluation, I think, here in the United States as to what do we want from Iran to be able to lift these sanctions that the Iranians can tolerate. And the Iranians have to take a hard look at themselves to say, how are we going to have to change our conduct to get the Americans to lift those sanctions? It's the same framework as the JCPOA, but take it into a different direction.
So, Mike, on page 15 of Ellen's report, there's this fascinating chart called the Gulf Military Balance. And it looks at the size of the forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, paramilitary, other forces, strategic missile forces, National Guard, and all that. But the number that jumped out at me was when you got to defense expenditures in 2015. So the Iranians come in for 2014 at just under 16 billion. And the Saudis come in at just about 82 billion. And when you look at the rest of the Gulf Cooperation Council states, they add up to another 30 or thereabouts. So the Iranians are outspent versus their Sunni neighbors by roughly 5 to 1, 4 to 1 to 5 to 1. So what are they so worried about?
Well, first I'd make the point that from the Iranian perspective, I think they view we have to take into account that Iran does have legitimate defense needs and defense interests, and they are convinced that their neighbors are out to harm the regime, certainly. But another point worth making is if you're looking at it in absolute dollar terms, I mean, the dollar terms are striking. The difference is huge. But it's what the Iranians invest in and how they invest and how the areas in their military that they choose to prioritize. They invest pretty wisely. Not to say that the Gulfies don't. The Gulfies have different security needs, so they invest, the Arab Gulf countries, in different areas, like ballistic missile defense. That's expensive. I mean, if you're getting a hold of Patriot batteries and THAAD and other equipment, that's high dollar costs.
And we keep dropping by with sales brochures.
That certainly benefits the U.S., benefits the EU. But it's worth noting that the Iranians invest in areas that give a good return for the investment that are very low cost. The perfect example I like to give when I'm talking about this is naval mines. Most of the mines in Iran's naval forces and their inventory are early 20th century technology. They're built on a Russian model that was developed prior to the Russian Revolution. So it's very old technology. Most of them, they have some advanced ones as well. But they pose a problem for U.S. naval forces, for the Gulf naval forces. They're very hard to deal with. And to counter that technology, we have to invest in very expensive mine clearing equipment. So the dollar cost terms are a tough way to look at it. But I think it is worth pointing out that they do have legitimate defense needs. They are surrounded by neighbors that they don't necessarily have Iran's best interests at heart. And we have to bear that in mind when looking at at the military side of things. I mean, I was looking at the military and trying to determine on the military issues, have there been any changes since the JCPOA? And there really haven't. You look at ballistic missiles. Iran doesn't believe that ballistic missiles are covered under Resolution 1322.
It's simply, the resolution simply urges them to show restraint versus the previous resolution also ignored, which actually barred them.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it said, if I recall, it's nuclear capable ballistic missiles,
right.
and they say our missiles aren't nuclear capable, and that's sort of some of the discrepancies in that regard as well. But they continue to test and develop their ballistic missile technology. They've made a lot of progress. They just recently, back in the late spring, had a launch of a short-range ballistic missile based on the Fateh 110, which is very accurate. One of the things they're working on is accuracy of the ballistic missiles.
How active is their cooperation with North Korea these days in that area?
They've
For a while,
exceeded.
they was pretty.
That's the interesting thing. They've exceeded North Korea. They've gone beyond North Korea. North Korea got their ballistic missile, got the Iranian ballistic missile program started back in the 80s, along with Libya. But Iran has far surpassed. There is cooperation. I mean, according to open source press accounts, there's cooperation between North Korea and Iran. But Iranians really have excelled the North Koreans in many ways in terms of their ballistic missile program. There's a problem with non-state actors. Now, there's the long-standing links with Lebanese Hezbollah, with Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, with Ahl-Haq, with Ansarullah in Lebanon. These are all problematic from the U.S. perspective. They're not necessarily, in most cases, attacking U.S. interests directly. There is one notable exception, and I'm sure you guys are aware of the incident in Yemen, which I think got the U.S. Navy particularly concerned. But there aren't. Iran's support for these groups is destabilizing, I think, from the U.S. perspective, because it exacerbates a lot of the sectarian tensions in the region, particularly in Iraq and Syria.
Let me ask you just a moment, and then I want to get back to Ellen with a similar question about what deal you think the IRGC ended up striking with the Supreme Leader after the nuclear agreement was reached July a year ago. There is a sense here, and it may simply have worked into urban myth, that the Supreme Leader's essential deal was, okay, we have taken away the nuclear program for the next 10 to 15 years. You'll get it back, but you're not going to get it back for a while. And it may not be in the working lifetimes of many of the senior leadership of the IRGC. But the compensation for that is you now have a freer hand than you did when the negotiations were going on, when we didn't want you messing up the negotiations by acting out within the region. Do you think that was, in fact, where the IRGC is, or do you see their activity as basically just a continuation of what they were doing?
I see it as more of a continuation, and I actually think the compensation was literally compensation. I get the sense that resourcing the IRGC continued actually at an accelerated pace post-JCPOA. But I don't see a change necessarily in the behavior. If you're looking regionally, like Quds Force activities, for instance, in Iraq or Syria, I don't see, those were all priorities that the regime had invested in. And I don't see the behavior of the regime in those areas necessarily changing. So I don't think there was a quid pro quo in the regional sense of how the IRGC was acting either in the Gulf. We know there have been incidents in the Gulf, but those incidents have been happening all along prior to JCPOA as well as post-JCPOA.
So Ellen, in your report, you talk about how one makes the shift from containment to deterrence here. Talk a little bit about what the elements of that deterrence you think would be.
Well, I think there'll be some continuity in how the United States positions itself and envisions the specific military and security threats posed by Iran. But I do think that we have to, look, I think containment, people have different definitions of what containment means. Do we mean literally physically blocking the Iranians from mobility in the Gulf? I think that's not very practical. But deterrence is a psychological concept and a political concept. It's not just about military deployments. So whether there are ways to signal to the Iranians what the consequences to them of certain actions would be, that makes them think twice. Now, this is the long story of U.S.-Iran relations, of whether, you know, in the end, we haven't had a direct U.S.-Iran confrontation. We've had sort of low-intensity dust-ups periodically that do not turn into sustained conflict, but nor have we persuaded the Iranians to take a different approach to their own national security. So what I take from Mike's discussion is that think about how subjective and how not static countries' notions of whether they feel secure or insecure are, okay? This is constantly evolving, and that we think of Iran as a country that sometimes presents itself as overconfident, that it can shape the fortunes of other countries, that it can manipulate the political factors in other countries, yet in other ways is a profoundly insecure country. The fact that it doesn't have any allies, that it doesn't have really friendly, trusting relationships with any of the countries with which it shares borders. So we have to sort of hold these two concepts in our heads at the same time. And I think for the US, the deterrence piece is, you know, Iran's great strategic goal is to get the United States out of the region. That's not going to happen. Okay, so on the assumption that the U.S. is there for the indefinite future, that we have our own agenda, if you will, for both American interests and the interests of our partners and friends, is our presence some kind of constant warning to Iran about what kind of, you know, actions we would consider acceptable and unacceptable. So we're a little bit locked in a dynamic that still has friction in it, but I'd like to believe can be refined a bit more so that there's some red lines is a dangerous concept sometimes, but that we can communicate to the Iranians and be clearer about a smaller list of activities that would be truly unacceptable to the United States, but also acknowledge that Iran is a regional power, that Iran has, and try to draw from the Iranians their own desire to see the region more stable. How do we find some common ground, but make clear to the Iranians that we will deter them from doing, you know, significant aggressive action towards us or towards any of our regional partners.
And once Secretary Kerry has left office, and perhaps when Javad Zarif does as well, what do you see as the replacement communication link there? Because if you think about the seizure of the U.S. sailors who went off into Iranian waters, much as, you know, that turned into a political and at one point even actually a campaign ad, the fact of the matter is it got resolved pretty quickly the way these things happen. And if you try to spin forward to a year when, you know, you might not have Kerry and Zarif there to have that conversation, I'm not entirely sure how you keep a small incident like that from blowing up.
Well, so for sure, I would hope that the minute we know who Secretary Kerry's successor is, that Secretary Kerry facilitate a personal contact, and that's kind of normal diplomatic behavior with many countries. In the case of Iran, it has a little more consequence to it. So first would be to make sure that the baton is handed quickly and that there is direct contact. Should the outcome of the Iranian elections mean that there's also turnover in their foreign ministry, then I think we'll have to, you know, respond in due course and hope that there are relationships. But then we see perhaps some continuity in the Department of Energy relationships that have been established. We have to, if we look at the network of contacts that worked for several years together in very intense circumstances, one hopes that, you know, people who are the technical experts in the bureaucracy, you know, move up the ladder a little bit. They know who their Iranian counterparts are. But I would encourage the next administration to really pay attention to that, to really give some time and effort and praise and encouragement and support for people in the national security agencies knowing who their Iranian counterparts are, and as appropriate, developing relationships with them.
Amir, there's a part of Ellen's report that pulls out some interesting quotes from Kerry and Ash Carter and the Supreme Leader and Rouhani. I want to read you one from Rouhani because in some ways it's his campaign slogan for the elections in the spring. The nuclear deal is an opportunity that we should use to develop the country, improve the welfare of the nation, and create stability and security in the region. Sounds bland and politician-like, but what's interesting is he ties the direct link between the nuclear deal and the development of the country, improvement of the welfare. So he's got to get reelected on a platform that basically says, I said I would get you this deal, and I said I would get you sanctions lifted, and I've done it. So the next term is all about reaping the benefits of what I've accomplished for you. Based on the kind of contacts you have in Iran these days, is that argument likely to fly?
I think it depends what the alternative is. I think the alternative to Rouhani isn't clear yet because the candidate list hasn't come out yet. But I think from the people's perspective, they're very disappointed. They don't necessarily blame him as much as they blame the United States. And it's interesting how Rouhani and the administration in Iran have said, we're doing our best, but we have this, superpower, above us that's not allowing us to reap the benefits. And I think that, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on where you stand, that's working. There was a poll done, I think a University of Maryland poll with a Canadian university. And for the first time, I was shocked at the numbers. The 74% of the Iranian population have a negative view of the United States. That's never been.
That's very high.
That's never been the case. It's always been the other way around. And I think that's because they blame the U.S. for, in some ways, not reaping the benefits of the nuclear deal. So I think that dynamic is to be worked out. I just want to go back to something that Ellen said, which I think is quite important. I don't think here in the United States we really appreciate what's happened in the region since the invasion of Iraq. I think Iran now, we view them as a regional power. They view themselves as a great power. As a great power with a sphere of influence now that extends from Tehran to southern Lebanon. And they're about consolidating their great power status. And what does the great power do? Well, eventually, it wants to challenge the status quo power. So, but they know what I think the U.S. red lines are. They're quite aware, and the U.S. red lines are in the Persian Gulf and energy security, for the world. Beyond that,
and the security of Israel
and the security of Israel and Saudi Arabia, of course. But when it comes to Saudi Arabia, I think they view it as a credibility issue. When it comes to Israel, they view it as a red line issue, and they're careful not to get close to those red lines. But they're also, when they see, from their perspective, when they see the Saudis, the Gulf countries, pour a lot of money into Syria to destabilize the Assad regime, they're going to respond. They'll respond in Yemen. They'll respond in other ways. They're not going to be a stagnant power. They are very much a reactive power.
Mike, as a reporter, I spend as much time trying to listen to the dogs that don't bark as the ones that do, since plenty come by and bark in my email every day. And in the post-deal period, the most remarkable comments I have heard, or silences I have heard, have been from the Israelis. So you visit Israel, what you hear from the Israeli Defense Force generals is, we actually haven't been in this good a position with the Iranians in some time. The nuclear thing is off the table. Our prime minister is not busy threatening every once in a while to go redecorate Natanz. There are certainly things we have to be careful of, particularly the import of missiles into Lebanon and so forth. But fundamentally, we're in a better place than 2 years ago we thought we would be in. Now, they can't say it too loudly lest the prime minister's office come down on them, but that's pretty much what I hear. I don't know if it's also what you hear.
No, I would agree. I think from the Israeli perspective, I don't think they went into it as optimistically as we did, but I think they've seen the benefits in terms of, by bringing Iran into the fold, perhaps it's kind of might moderate their behavior over the long term. It certainly kept things quiet in the north with Hezbollah, although a
Right.
lot of that has to do with Syria as well, and Hezbollah being distracted, but it's been remarkably quiet on the Golan.
Okay, so let me take you out 10 years, 8 years. So you look in the JPOA, and they can continue to do some work on advanced centrifuge technology. Starting around year 8 through 10, they can begin to do more testing and so forth. And then at year 15, basically the restraints are off. So as we get out to year 8, 9, 10, and I'm assuming the Iranians are going to do everything they can do legally right up to the line, and it's entirely conceivable that a different regime may decide to go test the limits and do more. How do the Israelis respond, and how do they make use of these years between now and then?
I think they're certainly going to be tracking the progress that we make. I mean, they're going to be looking for us to take the lead on that. And the extent of how well we manage the Iran relationship is going to affect how they plan and deal with contingencies for dealing with that relationship. They're probably going to continue to invest prudently in things like ballistic missile defense. Certainly, as I mentioned, the Iranians are making a lot of progress in that area. So that's going to be a priority for them. I mean, they're going to hedge their bets as the timeline extends. But I think they're going to be looking for us to take the lead and see how much progress we make.
And again, I mean, I do think that over that decade, if Iran feels that its status in the world, in the region, relationship with the Western powers has moved in a positive direction, one hopes that that would affect how their internal deliberations over, what are our national security requirements now. I mean, I think there is still a debate among Iran watchers of whether Iran has whether there's still an inevitability to them seeing being a nuclear power as a necessary ingredient of their status in the world, or whether they could that thinking could shift away from nuclear weapons over time.
I think the real question on the Israeli side, on the Iranian side, is how much can they jettison Israel from the sort of the ideological underpinnings of the Islamic Republic?
Yeah.
Is it going to be that focus that it's always been, or can somehow? It's doubtful it's ever going to be removed as an ideological constraint. But it's it could be sort of just a matter of pure rhetoric and pushed to the back, or it could be.
And along the same lines, and I'd welcome Amir's thoughts on this. Some people think the revolution is mellowing anyway. If you look at the demographics of Iran, you look at
Certainly
some of
aging,
the
if
it's
it's-
aging, it's
yeah,
aging,
yeah.
and then it replenishes itself with younger generation true believers. But still, revolutions do get tired over time. And some people think, Robin Wright had written a nice piece comparing Cuba and Iran of when you see that a fatigue has set in and that some of the revolutionary ideology doesn't make sense anymore. And how do you adapt to the outside world?
Amir, do you see that?
Yeah, I don't see. I think the Israel. I've always believed this. The Israel talk is a lot of rhetoric. Colin Powell's emails say, Israel is a nuclear power with 200 nuclear weapons or whatever it is pointed at Iran. Iran knows that Israel is a nuclear power. I think that Iran's support for Hezbollah, for them very much, is a deterrence issue to make sure that if Israel were to do something provocative, that they have leverage there. Iran right now is at war with Daesh or ISIS, and that's the national security challenge. That's on their border. That's what they really care about, and that's they're
Which you would think would give us some natural affinity, and that was sort of that was Kerry's gamble that would be the first thing, even if we didn't have this much broader relationship that Ellen said nobody thought we would get immediately. I agree with that. There was discussion in Vienna, in Lausanne, in those last runs of negotiation, that ISIS would be the interesting test case of cooperation. Hasn't happened.
Yeah, I think the Supreme Leader addressed this maybe right before the nuclear deal was signed. He gave a speech and said, we'll see how it goes with the nuclear deal, and we can then discuss other things. I think their view is the nuclear deal, they haven't reaped the benefits of that, and now he has said repeatedly, how can we trust the United States on ISIS and cooperating with them on other regional issues when we're not getting the benefit of the nuclear deal?
Mike, I wanted to ask you about an alternative to nuclear for the Iranians. So they announced with great fanfare soon after the Olympic Games Stuxnet attacks the U.S. did, the creation of a cyber corps. They put together a pretty subtle but very clear message in the attacks on Saudi Aramco and Rasgas. There are Iranian hackers who have been indicted here for the actions against the U.S. banks and not terribly successful manipulation of a small dam in Rye, New York. I used to play.
Which was mistaken for another dam.
It was mistaken, and I used to play on that dam as a 10-year-old, and I can tell you there's not enough water in it to flood a basement. But it was a nice try, whatever. And I don't think they've improved the locks since I was a 10-year-old either. But the development of the cyber capability has given them something that nuclear never could, because they can use cyber right away in various subtle ways. They can dial it up and dial it down. So we saw that happen for a few years. We've seen a little bit of an abatement of that in the past 12 months. Tell us how they are thinking about cyber in their broader strategy.
Cyber, this goes back to that thing I was saying about investing in areas that give you good return for investment. Cyber is perfect for the Iranians.
It's cheap.
It's cheap. They have a very well-educated population, particularly in technical sciences that would help if you're trying to create a core of cyber personnel. There is, of course, the point you brought up about Stuxnet. I mean, they feel that they've been on the receiving end of offensive uses of cyber as well.
They have been.
So and it makes sense for them to invest both in terms of defensive cyber and offensive cyber. Cyber, I don't see it as necessarily a replacement for a nuclear deterrent. I just don't think it's hard to envisage a scenario, I think, where you could see cyber deterring, for instance, say the deal fell apart, say Israel decided it was going to launch strikes on Iran. It's hard to see how cyber would prevent Israel from doing that, or if there was an incident in the Gulf and the conflict escalated between the U.S. and Iran. I don't see cyber as kind of as an alternative necessarily to nuclear deterrent. I see it as very complementary to use of proxies. It does fit with Iran's broader goals in the region and plausible deniability. The attribution issues always talked about for cyber. It's very hard to prove if a cyber attack occurs that it was a state-based effort. And even if you can prove it, it's hard to kind of prove it in the eyes of the public. It's great for signaling, and we saw that with the banks. We saw sort of a quid pro quo going on with attacks on Iran's nuclear program, them responding by attacking.
And they've seen now the revelation of a second U.S. program that was never put into place called Nitro Zeus that we describe in the documentary 0 Days, that would basically been, had there been a full conflict with Iran, a way to shut down their power grids, or so basically shut down the country with cyber-related attacks. How do they think about their own vulnerability?
They certainly, I mean, they view it as much as a vulnerability issue as a use for kind of using offensively. I mean, they've invested heavily in cyber passive defense. They created a Supreme National Cyber Council, is kind of the equivalent to the Supreme National Security Council that works purely on cyber issues. And most of the focus of that council appears to be defensive. So they're talking about hardening Iranian networks. They also view, one difference with the US is they view it as more within the realm, and this is true of other potential US adversaries as well. You're looking at China, you're looking at Russia. Iran tends to view cyber as within the broad domain of information warfare. So for them, defensive cyber includes controlling the information flow in and out of Iran, especially into Iran, because they're worried about their perceived adversaries using cyber to destabilize the regime. So there's an information component to it as well.
Ellen, a last question for you before we go out to the audience. So early in the Iran negotiations, there was a big discussion. Do you just focus on nuclear for this, or do you try for the grand bargain? And the grand bargain would be everything from nuclear to the diplomatic relationship to the economic relationship, everything we've been discussing here today. And the decision the administration made was, if you bite off something that big, you'll never get there. And not only that, you won't address, as you pointed out at the beginning, the number one issue the president felt he had to, which was to stop them from obtaining a weapon. So are we back at the position now where we can begin to have, once we're past this presidential election, we can resume discussion of a grand bargain? Is it even a wise thing to do? The elements of a grand bargain are all within your strategy, but you don't call it a grand bargain.
I would say I package it perhaps more modestly, that it's going to be incremental, that there's not a moment where all the pieces fit together perfectly and set out timetables and objectives. I think that we, both we and Iran, kind of miscommunicated at various times about what we meant by grand bargain. And I guess I've come to the conclusion that in the end it wasn't very promising, because it couldn't fundamentally address some of the ideological gaps. So I do think that we're managing a relationship that has, I mean, I think the best case scenario is managing a relationship that is not among natural allies, that is not a deep trusted relationship, but is seeing Iran as perhaps a rising power, or at least one of the largest regional powers. It is, after all, we haven't spent a lot of time looking at the Iran-Saudi dynamic, but Iran is right up there as one of the most important countries in the region, and that's not going to change. So I guess I see us managing Iran's trajectory in ways that do not assume that there is a perfect package where there's mutual agreement on the full suite of topics. I think we're always going to be triaging between where are there areas of cooperation and where are there enduring differences. I don't see that dilemma being solved in the next decade, and so I think the grand bargain talk turned out to be, in my view, not as productive as alternatives to it.
Okay, so we've got about a half an hour left, and so I'm going to call on some folks here for questions. Please tell us who you are, and please actually formulate a question out of your questions. And Barbara, we'll start with you. Microphone's coming right there.
Thanks. Barbara Slavin. I direct the Future of Iran initiative here, and I want to congratulate Ellen and everyone else for the report. I think it's excellent. One thing you didn't touch on was Russia, and there's been a lot of alarmism lately. Russia is, you know, the new power in the region. It launched flights against Syria from bases in Iran. I'd be interested in all three of you actually addressing to what extent you think there is now this new affinity between Iran and Russia, which in the past has been an adversary of Iran's. Thanks.
Mike, let's start with you on that, and maybe along the way you can tell us why you think the Iranians made the decision to allow the Russians to launch from Iranian territory, and why it stopped.
So quickly.
Well, I think they made the decision because the Russians kind of pressured them along those lines. I think there's a quid pro quo going on between the Russians and the Iranians right now, and I think the Iranians see a lot of benefit to furthering that relationship. But it was a sensitive issue. It's not something that the regime wanted to advertise, that there were Russian troops on the ground conducting operations from Iran into Syria. It was something that was because there's actually a constitutional prohibition against foreign forces being based on Iranian territory, any foreign force.
That's why they said they weren't based, they were just visiting.
It was just visiting,
Yeah.
yeah. But then there was talk about, them continuing that presence, but it's a very sensitive topic. I think, as keeping with me addressing the military issues, I think there's a lot of potential there for collaboration, but there are a lot of problems as well. I mean, the two sides remain very suspicious of each other. We have some analysts at CNA who work on the Russia side, and they go back and forth to Moscow, and they have a lot more access, obviously, than I do to Iran. But they talk to their Russian counterparts, and they say, well, where do you see this relationship going? And the Russians are viewing it totally from commercial terms. So, like, we can sell them this, we can sell them. We think it's like a $15 billion defense market over the next few years, well, especially once the provisions of the JCPOA are actually lifted in 2020. I think from the Iranian perspective, they're a little more wary. They're kind of coming into it saying, what can we get out of this relationship? We don't really trust the Russians, but they have technology that we need. So there's been a lot of talk about, munitions that the Iranians could acquire from the Russians, which could have a pretty big impact on the balance of power, for instance, in the Persian Gulf. I mean, there's been talk about acquiring advanced Russian anti-ship cruise missiles, the Yakhant, the Bastion system, Kilo subs, Su-30 fighters. I mean, it's the pretty high-end stuff if the Iranians have the cash to pay for it. With the Russians, it's got to be cash up front. They're not gonna-
I think that's right. I mean, I think, look, Iran has lost more territory to Russia in the last 200 years than any other country. There's no love lost between the average Iranian and the Russians. I mean, the cultures don't really mix well on the ground. So that's the first point. However, they fill in the gap. The Russians fill in the gap. The Iranians see that the Americans are arming the Gulfies to the teeth, and the Israelis have their own defense infrastructure. So they need to bring in Russian technology, Russian, the S-300, and Russian missile technology, and in some ways peaceful nuclear technology. I think they view it as transactional. I think Iran, as I said, you have to go into the Iranian mindset. They view themselves as a great power. They're not dependent on another great power for their security. So they view their relationships with other great powers, China and Russia, as purely transactional. I don't think they wanted them to get the Russians involved in Syria. I think they saw the tide turning in Syria, and they said, well, we need to get the Russians in case the Americans decide to come in with force, and to balance that out. But the real discussion is going to come in the diplomatic negotiation on Syria. How are the Russians and the Iranians going to divide that pie? And that's going to be, that'll be a tough negotiation.
I think during the nuclear talks, though, we did see the Russians as defending the Iranian position. I mean, so that there's been an alliance of convenience on a number of issues between Russia and Iran, in spite of the deep historic wariness. I imagine that the Iranians are enjoying a little bit playing Washington and Moscow off each other. That it gives them some leverage vis-a-vis the United States right now. It doesn't mean that that's a permanent solution for them. And in the end, we know that at least parts of the Iranian elite would very much prefer to have a deeper relationship with the United States, in which case they'd need Russia less, is my guess.
It's hard
the
to
Russians
imagine.
are playing
Yeah.
that game too,
Yeah.
by the way,
Yeah.
which is interesting.
Hard to imagine now, given the current atmosphere with Russia. They were actually pretty helpful in the Iran negotiations. I have more than a few American negotiators who told me that they were sort of happier when the Russians were in the room than, say, when the French were in the room in the course of the negotiations. And it tells you how much things have changed in this time. Sir.
Thank you. Trita Parsi from NIAC. Excellent discussion. Thank you so much for this. This is really much needed here. I haven't read the report yet, but with Ellen as the lead author, I'm sure it's absolutely excellent. I think David started off really well saying that within the four corners of the deal, it has really worked out well. But outside of it, there's still question marks. And clearly there was at least a hope that things would change, that Iran's conduct in the region would change. I'd like to make a comment and a question. I think one aspect in which there has been a change in conduct, or at least in posture, perhaps not so much post-deal, but post-Rouhani, is the posture on Israel. You do not have the same rhetoric against Israel now as existed during Ahmadinejad years, and it's a dramatic shift that I think should go noted. But when it comes to the change in conduct, I would like to see, imagine if this panel was now in Tehran and not in Washington. And there would be the still same type of expectation that perhaps after the deal there would be a shift in relationship. And they would be looking at changes in conduct of the United States in the region. If you were putting yourself in the shoes of Tehran right now, how would you assess how the U.S.'s conduct in the region has changed post-JCPOA in ways that potentially could make it helpful for the Iranians to move in a similar direction?
Ellen?
Well, I'm not sure there's too many examples to give, but I do think the administration is trying to use a vocabulary with our partners in the region that isn't to exacerbate tensions between the Arab side of the Gulf and the Iranians, but rather to aim high and say, look, in the long run, we're trying to help all of the parties in the region to find a greater formula for stability, and it's not resonating well when sectarianism is inflaming the tensions, and I think all parties could do more to tone that part down. But I'm not sure I have a good answer. I do think that the Iranians would see us as the big procurement deals with the Gulf Arabs, I think, make them feel that the U.S. has not been sincere in trying to, factor in their legitimate defense needs as well. But I think that we we do want the GCC countries to be more defense capable, because we don't want to be the combatant every time there's a serious problem. We want to play a deterring role, but not necessarily. We would like to see greater regional capacity to solve regional problems. So, so I would say there's a slight evolution of how we think conceptually about the American role in the region, and I hope the Iranians would hear something useful in that conversation, but there may not, maybe that's not enough of what they want to hear.
Gentleman on the aisle there.
I'm Harlan Owen with the Atlantic Council. I want to follow on David's point about a grand bargain, Ellen, and congratulations on the report. With an opportunity and a potential obstacle here. As you know, for nearly a decade, we had a two-pillar policy in the Gulf with Saudi Arabia and the Shah's Iran. What's happening in Saudi Arabia, which has not been discussed, is very interesting with the 2030 project and what the Deputy Crown Prince may or may not be doing. So is there a way possibly of leveraging on instability and the Islamic State in a more dramatic sense as a way of trying to get some kind of reconciliation going through Riyadh and even Moscow to get to Tehran? I'd like to get your thinking on that. And second, in terms of an obstacle, as you know, one of the Department of Defense's top 4 priorities, which it says explicitly, is to be prepared to deter and, if necessary, defeat Iran if a war should come. How do we negotiate with Iran when the Pentagon is actively planning to defeat it in a war?
Mike, you want to start with that one?
That's a hard question. The U.S. military has contingency plans. I mean, that's what it does. It prepares contingency plans for all sorts of issues. So I don't think it's to say that the U.S. has contingency plans for deter Iranian aggression isn't quite the same thing. And it's probably perhaps lost on the Iranians, but it isn't the same thing as saying we're planning on going to war with Iran. We plan for contingencies. Is what the U.S. military does. So.
Sorry, that's not exactly what Ashcroft says. When you take a look at the 4+1, the Pentagon is now actively planning and procuring material over the long term to be able to deter and if necessary defeat any one of those 4.
Here, I'll say, and I don't speak for CNA or the military on this. I know you as a former CNA could appreciate that. But I will say that Iranian military capabilities do pose a threat to U.S. forces in the region. This is clear in the Gulf. I mean, we've seen these incidents where there's real potential for sparking an armed conflict in terms of these naval encounters that are going on in the Gulf. And the U.S. has to be prepared to deal with those contingencies. So, and the Iranians too. The Iranians are investing in capabilities to counter the U.S., to counter high-end military. So we say they're focused on Daesh and ISIL, but the reality is they're also investing in their ballistic missile program, which is a high-end deterrent. They're also investing in naval capabilities that are designed to deal with high-end navies. They're investing in anti-ship cruise missiles. So these are things that are geared on the Iranian side to dealing with presumably the U.S., because I don't think there's any other high-end military that they really view as a major challenge. So I would say that would be my response to that.
I think, to follow up on your question, I think this is Iranians really have a tough time understanding the U.S.-Saudi relationship. Because from their perspective, Saudi Arabia, despite some of their common interests with the United States, represents much more of a strategic challenge to the United States, given the type of Islam that they've been exporting for the last 40, 50 years. And that's the type of Islam that Iran is at war with right now, vis-a-vis Daesh in Iraq. And you hear this a lot in Iran. The U.S. created Daesh, and the Americans sort of scratch their heads. I think to flesh that argument out is you have allowed Gulf states to fund, whether it's directly or indirectly, these Salafi Sunni groups in Syria, in Iraq. And now we have a mess on our hands. And because they are your client states, they are your partners, if you will, we hold you responsible. And that's Iran's tenor when it comes to Saudi Arabia. And they're not going to take it anymore from the Saudis. They're very much, so when you mention Israel, I think that's low on the list right now. It's wherever there is a flashpoint now. The Saudis poured money into Syria. They want to take Syria out of the Iranian orbit. They got Yemen. So you'll see that play out more.
Very
Can I
good.
just pick up a little bit on your, why I think Islamic State is not the ideal topic for U.S.-Iranian cooperation. I think it's just too tricky. I think that in general, the principle sounds right, that defeating Daesh is good for regional stability, then everybody can sort of calm down and have more appropriate political dialogue. But it's very fraught because of Iran's support for Shia militia, because it doesn't build trust with the Sunnis to have Iran on board as one of the anti-Islamic State active military forces. They can politically support the goal of defeating the Islamic State, but I think it's pretty complicated, particularly for Iraqi Sunnis and for Syrian Sunnis, to have Iran playing a role in that campaign. So I think we have to somehow, hope that Iran would politically support the objective, but not be part of the battle, in my view.
I think another issue, too, if I could just add to that, is if you're going to cooperate on ISIL militarily, it would involve some form of mill-to-mill coordination, and that's particularly problematic in the Iranian case.
Yeah.
Sir. Microphone come right here in front.
Thank you. Alan, congratulations on the report. You definitely deserve a lot of credit for tackling a really important subject and a very complex one. You mentioned that perhaps one of the ultimate objectives of Iran is to, and it's not going to happen overnight or ever, to replace the United States as the the regional hegemon, the regional cop, the regional power in the Middle East. If that's the case, then is it at all possible that what we're selling, they're simply not interested in buying? What does Iran really want from the United States, ultimately, in your opinion?
So it is true. I'm not sure that Iran has the ambition to replace the United States. I think Iran believes that the region should govern itself without outside powers, and that in the best of worlds, there'd be no outside powers in the region, of which the United States is the largest. But I think there's lots of steps along a continuum that Iran would find satisfactory in terms of an improved relationship with the United States. I think they do want, at some level, and it's hard to just say one Iran, because we know how complex their political system is these days, but I think they want the seal of approval of doing business. I see in the short run, Iran is motivated by economic self-interest. They're not willing to put aside the ideology yet. That would happen at a later stage of a process. So I do think that they've wanted for many years some level of acceptance of the United States that includes the ability to have economic transactions and to do business. I think their ambition for their own economy would, want them to have the best technology and the highest quality goods. And I think that trading with the Russians and with Asian countries, they know is second best in terms of their own aspirations. So I don't see them as, and this hegemon discussion is always a little squirrely because we don't really know, do they have an achievable doctrine to really dominate the region? I think they want to be respected as a unique power in the region. They will clearly have their allies and clients in the region, but I don't see them as having the ambition of replacing the United States.
As a tactical question, when you talk to young Iranians, they all want to be able to come to American universities, get visas, participate in American life. Obviously something that's viewed with considerable suspicion back home. And this is part of the divide, that you see within Iranian society. What do you think the chances are that we would actually get to that point, as sort of in the way station of building a more solid relationship? Doing the cultural, think about how many of the people who were negotiating the nuclear deal had studied in the United States.
Well, first of all, we're already doing it. I think there are a lot of cultural channels that are open. In my report, I tried to, let's not have that as a sort of little charming curiosity on the side, but let's try to bring it into a more normal, transactional way of doing business. But I think that it would be useful to check, because the same thing is happening on the Arab side, of whether the generations where all of your cabinet officers had Western degrees. There is now more capacity for people to get degrees at home. So whether we're seeing, in terms of ratios and proportions, are we seeing fewer Iranians that are Western educated? But Iran also has serious competitive universities. So we don't want to lose that some portion of the population would have had the experience of, you know, being exposed socially, culturally to the United States. So more the merrier as far as I'm concerned on that.
Ambassador
Okay,
Jeffries.
so there was a, I'm sorry?
Ambassador Jeffries.
Oh, I didn't see you there, Jim. Yes, please. Mike's coming to you. Just stand up, they'll bring one right around.
Part of my thunder may have been stolen by the last question, but I think the focus on replacing the United States might be going a bit too far. But I would take Mr. Hanjani's comment during the discussion earlier as about where a lot of people, certainly in the region, think Iran is, that Iran sees itself not as a major but as a superpower in the region. And with a sphere of influence. The problem with that is, leaving apart the specific manifestation of that, which is creating alternative powers and undercutting the governments of 3 Arab states and supporting the 4th, which is waging war against much of its population. That is extremely destabilizing, and our tradition since World War II has been to operate on a global system of collective security against regional wannabe hegemons and spheres of influence. We take a lot of risk doing this against really serious powers in the South China Sea and Ukraine. And we're faced with perhaps the need of doing that vis-a-vis Iran in the region. Is this, from terms of the report, something we don't need to worry about, or something that we can overcome by outreach, people-to-people contacts, good diplomacy, and economics? Thanks.
Let's address the first part. Well, I think Ambassador Jeffries, the U.S., this was of the U.S.'s own making. I mean, the U.S., there was dual containment in the 90s, and Iraq and Iran were balancing each other out. Neither Iraq wouldn't go eastward, and then Iran wouldn't go westward. And the United States, under President Bush, took that away. They went and invaded Iraq, removed Saddam Hussein, and the Shias that were in Iran, the Iraqi Shia, went to Baghdad. And the Kurds that are now in the north were all in Iran as well. So that, in a way, we've aided that thinking. So I think the Bush administration deserves, in some ways, they've made this monster, if you will, for their own mind. But they absolutely, they don't see the region the way that the United States does. They see themselves as the rightful heir of a great power with influence in Baghdad, with influence in Lebanon, with influence in Syria. And so they're going to fight tooth and nail to keep that sphere of influence for themselves. And that's why it creates destabilization with the United States and its allies.
I did not really envision Iran succeeding in establishing dominance of the region. I saw an Iran that, at least for the next decade, is still a bit preoccupied with some of its domestic requirements, still working very hard to sort of open up its economy, and that its relationships are finite. They're sort of limited in part by whether there's a receptive population in select Middle Eastern countries. I mean, 4 Middle Eastern countries as opposed to 20-something, I did not accept the premise that Iran is inevitably the dominant power in the Middle East. I saw Iran as still a country that will be important, but that compared to, if we take your premise that, the security comes from alliance structures, Iran is disadvantaged because the Gulf cooperation countries in their partnership with the United States are a much more robust alliance, and Iran is still a somewhat lonely country. Its relationship with Syria is a physically destroyed country. The natural resources, the human capital, what are they going to do? Are they going to spend money reconstructing Syria when the war is over? Is that such a great ally to have? I don't see Iran as hugely advantaged in terms of who its friends in the region are.
Although something I think that probably hasn't escaped Iranian notice is certainly the U.S.
Yeah.
relationship with the GCC is frayed somewhat. I mean, I don't think the GCC has many alternatives, and they've always been grumbling. It's kind of a common thing that they grumble about, that feeling that the U.S. doesn't have their backs. But that
Yeah.
relationship is fraying, and it's.
Fair enough.
Some might even say that there's some instability that's been induced into the equation by the fact that they're more encouraged to act on their own now, the GCC countries, in ways that the U.S. might not necessarily
Yemen being a
approve of.
really
Yeah,
extreme
Yemen's a
example.
perfect example.
But I think the GCC countries are always afraid that the U.S. is going to pivot to Iran, and I think that fear is exaggerated because the Iranians don't want that. They don't want to have that type of relationship with the United States.
Yeah.
So we've
But
got
the G-
about
but they believe it.
7 minutes left, so we're going to do short questions and short answers. So here we go, in the back, right there.
Hi, my name is Jeff Stern. I'm from George Mason. I'm a grad student there. My question is about the future of the Revolutionary Guards and the economy, and is it going to be possible for the U.S. to have a business relationship with Iran unless they privatize those industries? Thank you.
Superb question.
Yeah,
Amir?
that's a really good question. As the JCPOA and how the sanctions are working right now, you still have the Revolutionary Guard, by some estimates, control 40% of the Iranian economy. So that makes them a real power center. And I think they view the JCPOA, certain elements of them, as leaving them out in the cold. And that's when they can be destabilizing. That's when they kind of want the deal, some elements of them, not all, to not work.
Also, if it works, it cuts off one of the great black market businesses that kept them going for 3 decades.
Exactly.
Well, and Rouhani has had to promise them certain percentage shares.
Yes.
Of,
He's had to push back. There's been a total push back and forth between them because if he overreaches too much, then they can sort of pull the rug out from under him. So.
Very good. Right back there.
Hi, Josh Cram with the Truman National Security Project. I wanted to ask about what your thoughts are in terms of the Obama administration's strategy on Iran after Election Day until it moves out of the White House. I don't think it's wise to compare Iran and Cuba, but you've seen in the past couple of weeks and months, the Obama administration's tried to make the Cuba deal irreversible. Do you see the Obama administration doing anything in this period of time after the election to essentially solidify or continue to solidify the deal with Iran?
Does it need to be made more irreversible? Ellen?
I don't expect any dramatic things, and I think probably President Obama's moment would have been a handshake or a conversation at the UN General Assembly that didn't happen. So I think that would have been the bookend to his Iran policy initiatives. I don't expect any dramatic initiative between now and January 20th.
Right here in the aisle.
My name is Hassan. I was born in Tehran, and I'm very happy to see the panel speaking about the place that I was born. There are 2 things that we are missing here. One, the Iranian foreign policy is inclusive, not exclusive. But recently they introduced the invitation of Egypt into the talks in Syria. Second, when Gulf states, as you say, we say Persian Gulf, they have America on their side. One day maybe Iran will decide to give a hot water port to the Russians outside of the Strait of Hormuz. And what do the panel think about that?
Well, let's see. Who wants to pick that one up first? Amir?
I mean, I think this is the Iran. It's kind of funny because you go outside the Gulf states, Persian Gulf states. It's their relationship with Egypt is kind of warming because as Egypt is sort of pivoting away from Saudi Arabia, they're having some issues there. They actually want better relationships with their neighbors. I mean, that's one of Rouhani's policies is we want good relationships with our neighbors. And even within the GCC, it's not all bad. Oman is very good and very strong. Qatar and Kuwait, not bad. It's the Saudis that are sort of dragging the rest of them down. As far as the hot water port to the Russians, I wouldn't put money on it. that would not be, as you said, it's against the Iranian constitution, and once again, that goes against their notion of we're a great power. We're not going to invite another great power in and give them access.
You know, maybe they're temporary contingencies. I mean,
Yeah.
certainly, there have been a lot of Russia port visits in the Caspian and also in the Persian Gulf. They could be reaching out to the Chinese, things to sort of pressure the
Similar to
Gulf.
what the United States is doing in the Pacific, where we're doing these sort of
Exactly.
rotating visits. In the corner there, gentlemen, right there, in the back left corner, back there. Yep.
Hi, my name is Raza Marashi. Thank you very much for a great discussion. Very, very much appreciated. My question is about what happens if the moderate or best case scenario doesn't pan out. Not a lot of discussion is placed into the idea of what if this kind of falls apart? What if the next Iranian president or the next American president doesn't invest the kind of political will into this process that the current Iranian president and the current American president do? What does that look like? What does a devolution of U.S.-Iran relations in the JCPOA look like in your guys' view?
Superb question, because you heard Secretary Clinton give a speech at Brookings shortly after the deal was signed, where she basically talked about extremely strict enforcement.
Right.
There were some people in the White House who thought that was a speech that President Obama should have given after the deal was signed. It was different in tone from his. And there are people who wonder whether in about 5 years, when our attention is off on China or North Korea or Russia or some other problem, you begin to see fraying, especially after a new supreme leader may come in.
So the strategy that I've envisioned doesn't deconstruct any of the components of current policy yet. It would be contingent on things getting better. So it does sort of allow for scenarios in which things would get worse, not better, and assumes that we have the capacity to respond to those. But I'm also arguing for, sort of opening up our minds a little bit to changing our attitudes towards what's the end goal vis-a-vis Iran. And it's possible that the next president won't think that way. It's possible that the next president is more comfortable with seeing Iran sort of permanently in the adversary column, and that the prospects for constructive, positive engagement with Iran are really very limited. And I think Iran's comportment in the coming months has some, will help determine what's the environment that the next American president, inherits. But I am still hopeful that the achievement of the JCPOA in 2015 is a new baseline to think about U.S.-Iran relations. And so, and I think the Iranians have a lot to lose if things get so bad that the agreement is no longer, operational or operative. So,
well,
it's certainly a reasonable scenario to think through.
We have not run out of interesting topic matter here, but we have unfortunately run out of time to discuss it. So, Ellen, I want to thank you very much for this report. Amir, Mike, I want to thank you for terrific discussion, and thanks all of you for superb questions along the way. And appreciate it, and hope that post-election we can come back for more. Thanks.
Thank you.